Crikey guys, look here. We have a man in his natural habitat. You just don't see this every day. This man has no idea how to start this video. And this man, just look at him. Look at him fiddle with things like he's searching for the next inspirational intro to some freaking crazy video or something. Like, this man is out of ideas. What is going on, guys? So today we're back with another deep dive, and today we're actually going to be taking a look at Primeape, who is a pure fighting type Pokemon, maxing out at 2288. So actually a pretty solid number, not too far off from the Ultra League, like being a really solid pick for the Ultra League. But to get actually our best stat product out of Primeape inside of the Great League, we do want a 1 on the attack, 15 defense, 15 stamina at level 24.5. So at that level 24.5, it does equal a clean 1500, so looking pretty sharp there. Now when we compare Primeape to all of the Sinister Cup, all the Pokemon available, and we rank them by bulk and then by stat product, we actually get 102nd in bulk. And I know, that's pretty low, but 86th in stat product is actually not too bad. It's unfortunately not super high, but then again, the fighting types have never been one of the higher ranked Pokemon in terms of bulk and stat product. Medicham is like one of the freaking anomalies to that. Medicham just ends up being really good at being really bulky, and then his typing and, you know, all that whatever. In terms of like basically as a fighting type, we're right around where we should expect to be. Now of course all this does come from our base stats with a 207 on attack, 138 on defense, and a 163 in stamina. That's pretty decent. The stamina being quite high is pretty nice. Our defense is pretty low, but that's pretty standard for our fighting types. So nothing too out of the ordinary so far. Now when we get into our moves here though, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So we do have 3 fast moves: low kick, karate chop, and counter. Now, I'm just, okay, counter is just the obvious answer here. Low kick is really underwhelming. Karate chop could be okay, but counter just outpaces it in the damage, and outside of that they're pretty much identical for the energy gain, so counter just makes complete sense here. All 3 of them do have stat bonuses though, so I guess for what it's worth, they're all decently good for that, but counter just definitely outpaces everything here. But in respects to each move, low kick here for 2.5 energy per turn, we do get 2 damage per turn with a 2.4 after stab. Karate chop is going to be 3.5 energy per turn for 2.5 damage per turn, but after stab it does bump up to a solid 3 on the damage. Then lastly, counter ends up at 3.5 energy, the same as karate chop except for a whopping 4 damage before stab, which goes up to 4.8 after stab. So definitely the most solid choice is going to be counter. Now in terms of our charge moves though, these ones right here are what is going to get interesting. So we do have cross chop, which is a legacy move. We do have low sweep, night slash, and then close combat. So let's just go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room. Low sweep is weird. It's just, it's kind of underwhelming. It is only 40 energy, but it only does 40 damage. It's just not really hitting on a whole lot in terms of our efficiency. It just kind of is underwhelming compared to the moves that we already have. Night slash, on the other hand, for the exact same energy at 40 energy to fire, we do get 50 damage, which isn't substantial. It's not huge or anything. At a 1.25 damage per energy ratio though, in this cup, the dark type charge move, holy cow, it does wonders for Primeape. It actually does really well in a ton of different scenarios. And then we have cross chop and close combat. So I intentionally left these 2 last because these 2 are the 2 that kind of have the biggest talking point in terms of our charge moves. So cross chop of course is going to be a legacy move. For 35 energy we get 50 damage at a 1.43 damage per energy ratio. After stab though, it does get bumped up to a 60 on the damage for a 1.71. Close combat is a whopping 60 energy, but it does get a total 100 damage for a 1.67 on the damage per energy ratio. But after stab, it does get bumped up to 120 on the damage for a clean 2.0 on the damage per energy ratio. So the reason that these 2 moves are kind of interesting is because Close combat is kind of like the next best thing if you don't have Legacy Primeape with Cross Chop, because if you don't have Cross Chop, you're kind of going to forfeit a little bit of speed. And if you want that speed, for what it's worth, I guess you could run Low Sweep, but I mean, it's going to be kind of underwhelming. I'll just throw that out there. You'll still have a little bit of the speed, but you won't have enough of the oomph to really go along with that speed, so you kind of end up falling behind in some scenarios. But if you don't have Cross Chop, I actually ran a few numbers that I want to go over that kind of make a case that close combat isn't too much worse in most scenarios. So let's actually jump into some shields here. Up against the entire cup, we do have Cross Chop and close combat on screen here. So in the 0 versus 0 up against the entire cup, Cross Chop actually ends up with a 50%, while close combat is a 46.8. So already Cross Chop is pulling out a little ahead, but in the 2 versus 0, we have an 83% for Cross Chop and an 81.9 for close combat. So Cross Chop is actually inching even further ahead. In the 0 versus 2 though, 11.7% for Cross Chop with a 12.8 for close combat. So close combat does pull up a little bit closer here. And then in the 2v2 shield scenario, they actually both tie with a 42.6. Now if we average all those numbers together, Cross Chop ends up with a 46.825%. And then close combat ends up with a 46.025%. So very, very close in terms of performance here. The only ones that kind of give us a little bit of weariness are that 0 versus 0, so in a type of closing situation, if you will, close combat isn't going to be necessarily as good, where we do drop a few more matches where if we would have had Cross Chop, it would have been way better. The 2 versus 0 is basically the same thing, but the 0 versus 2 is the flip side of that. If we're actually going up against Pokemon that have more shields at their disposal, Cross Chop, for whatever reason, performs worse. See, this is kind of where I think in simulations it's going to be a little bit skewed, because in the scenario where I have more moves that I can toss out, even though they're not going to do a substantial amount of damage, if I have the ability to just toss out a bunch of moves, I feel like I would be able to burn through their shields a little quicker than if I would have had close combat. But here's the case, because you don't actually lose much speed if you have close combat, because you can still fall back on Night Slash, because Night Slash is only 40 energy. Cross Chop being 35 energy, yeah, we would get to Cross Chop just a little bit faster, but the case still stands for once we burn through those two shields, we don't have the damage to really seal the deal on some of those matchups. So close combat actually helps us out by just being that beat stick that we can just be a heavy hitter with. And that's what makes it a little bit better in that 0 versus 2. Then of course in the 2v2, since we tie, we just, kind of take that for what it is. So up against the entire cup, they're looking pretty freaking even so far. But in the meta, this is where it kind of starts to show some strides for Cross Chop here. So if we look at the 0 versus 0 up against the condensed 26 Pokemon that PvPoke defines as the meta, we actually have in the 0 versus 0 a 34.6% for Cross Chop with a 38.5 for close combat. So we're already pulling a little head with close combat there. In the 1 versus 0 though, it's a 69.2 for both sides. So it doesn't matter which move you run, in that 1 versus 0, you end up performing pretty much identical. Next, in the 0 versus 1, we end up with a 19.2 for Cross Chop with an 11.5 for close combat. So as you can see right there is where close combat just kind of drops the ball. What's odd is that unlike the last scenario, where we basically were pulling ahead when we were shields down, lastly, in the 1v1, we end up with a 38.5 for Cross Chop and a 26.9 for close combat. So, unlike in the entire cup, when we go up against the regular condensed meta, the Pokemon that you're probably going to be seeing a ton of at your tournament, you start to fall apart once the enemy has some shield advantage on you. And it just kind of ends up tossing us in a worse position with close combat, because when you average all these shielding scenarios together, we end up with a 40.375 on Cross Chop with a 36.525 on the close combat. So as you can see there, Cross Chop is way ahead of Close Combat. Unfortunately, Close Combat, I still think that it's an okay substitute if you don't have Cross Chop, but it's kind of one of those situations where I don't have the legacy move. Do I really want to run this Pokemon if I don't have it at its maximum potential? It kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do that. So based on that, considering that in the entire cup we won just barely with Cross Chop with a tiny bit more of a percentage win, and in the condensed meta we had a way better percentage, we're actually going to stick to the moveset with Counter, Cross Chop, and Night Slash for the rest of this video, which let's actually go ahead and break down in that 1v1 scenario where I have a shield, my opponent has a shield in the condensed meta. Let's actually break down which ones we actually win and lose up against. So if we take a look at all our wins, we actually have wins up against Probopass, Bastiodon, Dragon Tail, Steelix, Mudshot, Poliwrath, Mawile, Bubble and Dynamic Punch Poliwrath, Thunderfang, Steelix, Bubble and Power Up Punch Poliwrath. And then we have Feint Attack, Dusclops, and Empoleon rounding out our wins. One of the more interesting things about Primeape is if you look at the histogram for the wins and losses on PvPoke, there was like this giant, like 2 little mountains and then a valley in between. So what that ends up meaning is that there are Pokemon that we just clearly win against, and there are Pokemon that we just clearly lose up against. It's just kind of the way that this goes. Out of the Pokemon that we lose up against, you're going to notice a huge trend here, which we'll break down here in just a second. But Alolan Raichu, Hex Alolan Marowak, Fire Spin Alolan Marowak, Dynamic Punch Medicham Lugia, Power Up Punch Medicham, Drifblim, Hex Dusclops, Banette, Girafarig, Bronzong, Claydol, Gallade, Haunter, Cresselia, and Gardevoir. Did you catch the theme in there anywhere? Well, let's go ahead and break it down. If we take a look at each individual typing here, up against the Ghosts, we have Alolan Marowak, both variants here, Hex and Fire Spin. We have Drifblim, Hex Dusclops, Banette, and Haunter. So the interesting thing is that we don't have both variants of Dusclops here. We only lose up against the Hex variant. And that's because that Dark type Feint Attack does end up doing worse up against Primeape as a fighting type, because we're pretty much going to be able to resist a ton of that damage right out of the gate. Looking into the Psychic types, all of the Psychic types end up beating us here. Yeah, so Alolan Raichu, Medicham, both variants being Dynamic Punch and Power Up Punch, Lugia, Girafarig, Bronzong, Claydol, Gallade, Cresselia, and Gardevoir, all are horrible matchups for us, which is to be expected. Considering that we're a pure fighting typing, we do have a lot of problems with a ton of the Psychic type moves that come at us, and even some of the Fairy type moves that you do see like on Gardevoir and things like that, so it's pretty much an all-around bad time for the Psychic types. But then inside the fighting types, we do have Medicham does appear again and Gallade does appear again. So if you like wanted to spin it in some way that made Primeape look a little bit better, technically we don't lose up against any of the non-Psychic fighting type Pokemon. So that sounds better than, hey, we lose up against 3 of the fighters, for what that's worth. And then the Steel types, the only one that we will lose up against is Bronzong. And Bronzong's big thing is not to use Feint Attack, but to use Psychic type moves. So using Confusion as its fast move, of course it's going to be able to tear through a ton of things, but especially through the fighting types. So one of the bigger themes here with Primeape is that it actually could be a really interesting off-meta pick. Yeah, we're gonna have some resistance up against the Ghost types right out of the gate. I mean, the fighting type moves don't really like help us in terms of up against the Ghost types. We do rely heavily on that Night Slash, but I mean, for what it's worth, I guess if we were able to kind of dodge some attacks here or there, have a Night Slash ready to fire, and we have to drop in on a Ghost type and throw it out, we wouldn't be in too bad of a position. And up against the Psychic types, it's a similar story. Most of them aren't going to have too big of a problem with us until possibly we have a little bit of energy saved up and we can jump out and toss out some Night Slashes, possibly securing a win if we're lucky. But the biggest theme here is that the Primeape is actually pretty good. I actually like Primeape. I really do think that he's a really interesting off-meta pick, and if he is one of your picks into your tournament, I think he could actually perform pretty well. Pending that you have Cross Chop, because Close Combat does start to slip like we talked about inside of the actual meta. Cross Chop, Night Slash, Counter is a solid moveset. And you, as long as you have answers for the Psychic types outside of Primeape, and as long as you have an answer for most of the Ghost types outside of Primeape, I mean, I think he's pretty solid. But that is actually going to be it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thanks so much for watching. Always remember that you can go into the Discord, vote for the next deep dive. I don't have a clue what it is, but I will go ahead and show you that I think it was on this side last video, that this is what's coming up next, and this one is going to be a fun one, I hope. But until then, I'm going to go ahead and bid farewell. We do have the Ferocious Cup coming up very, very soon, so I'm kind of preparing myself for that. I got to get some of my spreadsheet stuff together. As soon as the Ferocious Cup is announced, we will cease to do deep dives on the actual Sinister Cup. We will completely move on to the Ferocious Cup. I don't want to get behind on it, kind of like I was with the Sinister Cup, so I'm going to jump on that as soon as I possibly can. As always, the spreadsheets and all the stuff that I use will still contain everything for the Sinister Cup. It's not like I'm gonna delete them or anything. They're just gonna be in the back, basically. So until then, I'm gonna go ahead and head out. Thank you guys again for watching. Thank you for hanging out. But until our next video, I'm gonna go ahead and play those ending credits for you. Thank you guys so much for watching. Always remember that if you like to like videos, you could do that, but if you don't, you could be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments below about the video. I do highly appreciate you guys watching. If you guys want to support me in any way, there are several links down in the description for Patreon, joining the community here on YouTube, or even just directly PayPal if that's your thing. I greatly appreciate everyone's name that's on screen, as you guys have showed some sort of support outside of just viewing the videos, and I thank you guys. You don't understand from the bottom of my heart. So until our next video, guys, I will catch you then.